On the stormy night of June 15th, 1947, a horrifying roar shook the buildings of Perkinsville, Vermont. Just past midnight, as people looked up through the fog and heavy rain, they saw green and red flashing lights as an immense airplane swooped low overhead. Seconds later, the motors stopped, and a blazing flash lit up the countryside, showing clearly the outline of Hawks Mountain against the sky. Immediately, a search party headed up the mountain to investigate and see if they could help survivors. They would discover that no one could have survived, as this B-29 superfortress, terribly off course on a training mission, flew directly into the ledges of Hawks Mountain. For more than half a century, people have remained fascinated with this story of Vermont's worst aircraft disaster. They have hiked up to view the remaining wreckage at the site, and to pay respect to those who lost their lives here, and to connect with the history of a very big event in this little Vermont town.
I'm Willis Wood, and I'm lucky enough to be the president of the Wethersfield Historical Society, which is sponsoring this hike. There's two people especially that we should thank. One is Matt Keniston, who's going to lead us, and who built the trail that goes up to Hawks Mountain. And the other is Gil Whittemore. He owns the site where the plane crash was. And he said that he was delighted that people were going to come and look at it, but what he really wants people not to do is to take away mementos from the plane crash. There'll be some chunks of metal that are too big to take away, and there'll be some other little ones that you could easily walk away with. But what makes it so interesting up there is that parts of the plane are still there, so please don't put them in your pocket and hike back down with them. It's maybe an hour and a half hike up.
About an hour up and a little less down.
And we can all more or less go at our own pace. When you get lost, if you go downhill, you'll get to the bottom. It won't necessarily be the bottom where you started out.
Sounds like Yogi Berra.
There we have some really nice. The Historical Society has some reprints of a story by Barbara Woodbury, the late Barbara Woodbury, and they are the Hawks Mountain plane crash on the stormy night of June 15th, 1947. They're pretty interesting. One thing that interests me about them is just that they go back 50, 60 years to life in this little village. So the plane crash was about at midnight, and half the town ahead of time was up. They were all at parties, it seems like. So if you read down through, everybody just seemed to be up and at 'em. Everybody I know at midnight on June 15th of last year was fast asleep. But that Saturday night in Perkinsville was a lot like other such nights with people going to dances and the movies, staying up late. Delma Pike had been called to operate the switchboard. John Hastings sat by his radio. Ted and Gert Barrows were overseeing a dance. Joan Hicks was having a party on the porch of her parents' house. And then the plane crash came over town, and several people said, boy, that thing's going to crash if they stay at that course. And there was a terrible explosion which woke the half of Perkinsville that was asleep up. The plane ran straight into the mountain. 12 people died. The plane was very off course.
That night, we'd just come home from a party, and it was a dreadful night. Luckily, the party wasn't far away. And we came in the house, it was just a little after midnight. And all of a sudden we heard this roar, this plane. Couldn't imagine why a plane would be out in that. But it came closer and closer, and finally right over the house, and it was just shattering. The noise, I wondered if the chimneys would fall. Got over, And all of a sudden, silence, dead silence. All you could hear was the rain pouring down. And I ran and looked out the window, and sure enough, all along the ridge of Hawks Mountain was this glowing red. You couldn't tell where it was. It was just the whole, from the lower part along the ridge, glowing red because of the heavy mist. And my husband took a look, and he ran and got his boots and his flashlight and a coat and took off. He went down and picked up Dick Butterfield and Phil Woodbury. They'd been at the party too.
Got home from a dance. Backed the car out in the yard, and maybe 12:30 or so at night. I had this low plane flying very, very low. Went over the house, or went over by the house, not sure which one. I said, that's low. And the first thing you know, you could see where it banged, crashed right into the mountain. And after that, it was all flames. Big, big flame. And just as soon as the flame come, it was a hard, extra hard rain. I said to myself, that plane has gone into the mountain, one of them rocks or ledges up there. It was in the nighttime, dark. I lived in town here all my life. I know the mountains pretty well. And I was only a kid, I was only about 17. And I could scoot up that mountain like a jackrabbit. Went up to the Mahoney farm. Johnny Hastings, he happened to come up. Decided which way to go, and then to Bernie Lazary from Springfield. Must have heard about it. And he come up. So we all three headed up there.
I got home that evening. It was quite late, and it was a rainy night and foggy. And when I got out of the car to go to the house, I heard this plane circling overhead. And it kept going round and round, and all of a sudden it stopped. I didn't hear it no more. And I happened to look up on Hawks Mountain. I could see it kind of a place light up a little bit.
My name is Brian Lindner from Waterbury, and I have an interest in Vermont aviation, particularly in Vermont military aviation. And that all started when I was a boy of around 10 and hiked Camel's Hump and first stumbled across the wreckage of Vermont's most famous military plane crash, and that's the B-24 bomber that crashed on Camel's Hump during World War II. And I've spent most of my lifetime researching every possible detail of that. But over the years, I expanded out and started researching all the other military plane accidents in this state, and I'm up at this point to have documented roughly 125 different military plane crashes. Over the years, I had heard about the B-29 crash on Hawks Mountain, and I became more and more interested in it, particularly once I found out that even today that remains as our worst aviation disaster in Vermont. It killed 12 men. The plane that crashed on Hawks Mountain was flown by Lieutenant Bob Fessler, a decorated World War II combat veteran. And Bob Fessler was a well-respected pilot. From everything I've ever seen, he was obviously very safety conscious. And he had flown a number of missions in the Pacific during World War II, flying this particular type of plane, the B-29 bomber. In fact, there is even a photograph that appeared in Life magazine showing Bob Fessler walking around his B-29 bomber just prior to takeoff on a bombing mission over Japan. He flew the B-29 bomber, which was the largest type of bomber that the United States used during World War II. In fact, this is the type of bomber that dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Well, this particular flight started June 14th, 1947 at Davis-Monthan Base, which is in Tucson, Arizona. And the purpose of the mission was originally to fly to Andrews Field near Washington, D.C. and practice navigation en route. And then from there they were going to fly up to Hanscom Field near Bedford, Mass. And land there, and also do some drills in navigation. Now we know with the benefit of hindsight of what happened is they were under orders to use only dead reckoning navigation, which basically means you use only the assets that are in the aircraft itself. You can't use your radio compass and that sort of thing. So they had no navigational aids, modern navigational aids that we would expect them to have, because they were ordered not to use them. Now, en route sometime between Tucson, Arizona and Andrews Field, they realized that the weather in the East Coast had really basically closed that airport. So he diverted his flight from Andrews and landed at the Greater Pittsburgh Airport. At that airport, some of his passengers got off for the next leg of the flight. They took off knowing that they were heading towards bad weather, but thinking they could fly over it en route up to Hanscom Field. Well, en route to Hanscom Field, they ran into a heavy rainstorm and obviously got lost. And then what happens is it's nighttime, an extremely heavy downpour, and people in Springfield started hearing this monstrous 4-engine bomber circling overhead. Now, some people claim that they not only heard it but saw the lights and thought that the pilot was signaling for help, which probably is not true, but it's a colorful rumor. But at any rate, they turned over the airport in Springfield and unknowingly were flying directly at Hawks Mountain. Now, they should never have been at this altitude. They should have been much higher, and we'll never know why they were at this altitude. The only thing we can say for certain is that they were clearly lost. When you read the actual Army Air Force crash report, it states that they probably thought they were near Hanscom Field, and that shows you how lost they were. They're over Springfield, Vermont, and they think they're close to Boston. And with absolutely no warning whatsoever, the bomber flew absolutely straight into a cliff. I'm convinced the crew never knew what happened. It was all extremely instantaneous. But you get America's largest bomber flying in a driving rainstorm with zero visibility. They fly straight into a cliff, and 12 men are killed instantly. The bomber spreads wreckage over a good section of the mountain, mostly landing at the bottom of the same cliff. And then the wreckage bursts into fire, and there's a pretty significant fire going. And a lot of the aluminum melted. If you go to the crash site today, you can still find pieces of melted aluminum there.
Approximate time of this plane came over, I was living in the Veterans Apartments on South Street. I was working at J&L, the night shift, and I got out of work at normal time at midnight. And by the time I got home, it was probably 15 or 20 minutes past midnight. And I got out of my car, and I could hear this loud noise. I looked up, and it was misty and foggy, and I could see this plane right over me, and I would guess it was not more than 50 feet above the ground. And there was enough light. Apparently, they had lights on in the plane and enough ground light shining up there. So I could see a door was open in that plane, and there was someone standing there, apparently in panic, trying to figure out where they were. And it happened so quickly, and I think I shouted, pull up, you're going to hit the hills. And I really wasn't thinking about mountains. I was thinking about the hills around Springfield.
Well, it's amazing that after so many years, that many people are still interested in that event. And there are still connections to be made with people still in Wethersfield.
We've heard Edith Hunter just say that there continues to be an interest in the B-29 crash. And the very next day after she and I were talking, she got a phone call from Colonel E. Newton Tyndall, who then called me, and he was one of the crew that luckily got off the aircraft in Pittsburgh. He went on to have a 30-year career in the service.
I was the navigator on that crew that crashed it on Hawks Mountain, and the day that we left Tucson, where we were stationed, I was in the navigator's seat, navigated all the way into Pittsburgh. Now, initially, the flight had been arranged, had been scheduled to take me into the Washington area because I was going on a 30-day leave. There was a navigator on board to take my place after I got off. The weather was good all the way through the western part of the country. As we continued on, though, we started getting reports of weather buildup in the eastern part of the country. The co-pilot handled the radio and contacted the Washington area. We found that the weather was bad there, too bad to make a landing in Andrews. So we diverted to Pittsburgh. I got off the airplane there, and there were four other people aboard that had wanted to go to the Washington area. They were going to get off in Washington also. Commercial flight was being held up there. So I got on board that flight. We got into Washington about 5 o'clock in the morning. And I just sat there and waited. Shortly before 7, I got up and walked across the terminal to a water fountain to get a drink. And as I was coming back, I passed two men standing talking about, I heard one talking about a crash of a B-29. And so I stopped. I asked him what I'd overheard him say. And he said, well, he heard it on the radio as he was coming to the airport. The information they broadcast was simply that a B-29 had left Pittsburgh and crashed up into northern Vermont. Well, I was almost certain it was our airplane because we were the only B-29 that had been in the greater Pittsburgh. Colonel McPherson got there to pick me up a little after 7. I told him what I'd heard, and we left Washington National and went to Bowling Army Airfield right across the Potomac to check on it. Brought out the sheet of paper, the record of the casualty list, and I looked at it. I was shocked. My name was on the casualty list. I told the man there that this is my name. Showed him my identification and everything. I thought by doing that, everything had been taken care of. Turned out that that was not the case. We went to McPherson's home, and he made a pot of coffee. A short time later, the phone rang, and it was our squadron commander down there at Tucson, Davis Monson Army Airfield, calling to tell McPherson that I had been killed the night before. And he had a good sense of humor. He said, well, he looks all right to me sitting here now. My wife's flight was due in about 12 o'clock, so about noon, McPherson and I went back to Washington National Airport to meet the plane. We were going to Georgetown, Delaware, where I grew up and where my wife was from, for the 30-day leave. Monday morning, it was about 10 o'clock, I received a phone call there from a reporter on the Wilmington evening paper. At that time, I did not know the awful mistake that had been made about my being listed as killed in the accident. Later on that week, at the end of the week, I received a telegram canceling my leave and had to return to Tucson. I learned there from two different sources what had happened. Mills himself, the squadron commander, the base chaplain, and another fellow, friend of ours, had gone to our home in Tucson to tell my wife that I'd been killed. This then was a notification of next of kin. She was not there, and so they went next door. And the couple next door, very close friends, good friends of ours, Al and Peggy Lose, and asked if they knew where my wife was. And Al told them that he had just taken her to the airport, that she was going on American Airlines into Washington. They made a mad dash from there, our home, to the airport. When they got there, her flight had departed. So that was just a stroke of luck that she was never notified.
This crash was in newspapers all across the United States. It was covered in Boston, Tucson, New York Times. Every major newspaper carried it. This is one of the more interesting photos because it shows the wreckage laying at the bottom of the cliff with several rescuers actually walking through the wreckage the day after the accident. In this photo here, you can actually see some of the digits from the tail of the airplane that give you the serial number. And the full serial number on this plane was 44-62228.
He came back about 3, I would guess. It took him about 45 minutes to get up there. And on the way, they saw flares, so they were hopeful. But he said when they got there, it was a total, no one could have survived it. There were pools of flaming gasoline and this smashed plane, and the tail of it, huge tail of it, was sitting up in the trees. So he got, right after they got there, some other people came in, John Hastings and a few others that had made it up. But they all agreed there's nothing. And the flares had gone because the fire had reached that area. So when he came back, it was 3:30 or 4. And he called Fort Devens. That was an Army Air Force base then. And they said there's no plane like that in that area. There's no B-29 up there. But my husband had gotten the numbers off the tail of the plane. Told them that. And they said, we'll call you later. So after about 15 minutes, they did call and say, yes, that could be it. And that it had just refueled in Pennsylvania, 1,000 gallons of fuel. The strangest thing was, we didn't hear any boom. I don't think anyone that I've ever talked to heard a boom. It must have just flashed, exploded.
We're sitting here with a friend of mine, Dick Pratt. He and my dad were photographic partners for many years way back, and Dick has got a lot of thoughts on the crash of the B-29. My dad was one of the first ones up there. I was only 5 years old at the time, so I don't remember any of it, but Dick remembers a lot.
His dad was the first one up there, and I can't remember the signals, but there was either 1 for life and 2 for no life or something, but whatever came up, there was no life. And I was down there with, well, of course, half of Perkinsville was up by then. Of course, he had the raincoat on because in that picture because it was a hell of a thunder shower.
Yeah, it was storming that
night.
night.
There was a storm that night earlier.
I have seen the actual photograph of my dad here with this raincoat on. Like they said, it was all covered with oil. He basically had to throw it away when he came back down off the mountain.
We've been up to the Kool-Aid dance, and we came down to the corner lunch here in Gassett to get a bite to eat, and somebody came in and said there'd been a plane crash down in Perkinsville. And you could see the fire up on the mountain. That was before your dad had sent up the flares. So we just waited around, and when they set up the flares, showing there was no life, a bunch of us, we started. Yeah, we were right up that night, and then when we came down the next day, of course it was all military, and they were stopping them down at the Mahoney farm. And that's where the base was, and that's where we all came out with the bodies.
So the Mahoney farm is where the operations base camp all was for everything? Now, do you have any idea how long this whole operation took from the time they really started up there until they got things pretty well cleaned up?
Well, I would imagine a couple of days because they had see, it was the next day when we came down to the Mahoney farm there, and that's when they were taking the souvenirs away from them. Probably a couple of days. I know they fed us sandwiches and coffee and stuff like that in Mahoney farm.
People really wanted to take home souvenirs.
Oh yeah, they had a pile of souvenirs down in Mahoney farm. Pretty as high as the state. Parts of silver, wings and anything they could find. Yeah. And this woman had a foot, a man's foot. And they took it, I remember they took it away from her.
Now, I did hear too that they originally thought there was only 9 people on board. But there ended up being
their lieutenant said,
12.
Well, when they got 11, he said we might as well quit because there's 2 more now that's supposed to be on the plane. That's what we were told. So we were down the mountain then, and it was the next day before they found the 12th one. That woman was poking around and lifted up something, tin or a wing or something, and there's a guy in the chair, dead.
Tell us a little bit more about this fellow from Georgia.
Wow. He had an accent you couldn't hardly understand him. I got kind of a funny feeling that probably he wasn't a regular rescue worker. Yeah. I think he might have got drafted in the process. He didn't go into that business at all. And he'd had enough. And as I say, when we picked up 1 or 2 there, and it was in real rough shape, and he walked over to the lieutenant and saluted, and said, "I'm all done." Said, "I've had enough. You can shoot me or court-martial me, but I'm done." Up the mountain he went. Like as I say, when it went over Springfield, they said it was so low it rattled the buildings. It woke up the whole town, they said. And that's when your dad and whoever else, they all headed to the airport. Probably they didn't even get up to the edge of town before that thing hit. But the B-29, I don't know what the speed was, but from Springfield to Hawks Mountain, not very far with a B-29. And they probably just about time to get into the cruiser before it probably hit.
It was quite a thing. It was so low that you knew something was going to happen. That's the way it was. And it happened quick.
I happened to be in the police department headquarters in Springfield when the call came in. And so they said, Doc, climb into the fire engine and come with us. Mm-hmm. It was raining, a very miserable night. But I went up to Perkinsville, and there they organized a party to go up, and I joined them, carrying my medical bag with me in case I could help somebody that might have been thrown out of the crash before it actually hit. But there wasn't anybody, so I really couldn't help anybody. When we got on a little ridge and we looked down and the crash was right there, and then of course we knew there wouldn't be anybody.
I was reading that you hiked up.
It was nowhere near as difficult because it was a nice day, but for the actual crash it was a miserable, rainy, cold night. This is my bag, and this is what I carried with me up to the top of the, up to the crash.
And you say it's real heavy.
Oh, well, sort of.
Oh, that is. That must be 30 pounds?
I never have weighed it.
Oh my, and you carried that up with you.
But, yeah, and that I used to use that on making house calls. I always carried it into the home with me.
This happened, of course, during graduation time when my girlfriend, who is now my wife, was graduating. I was home from the Signal Corps in New Jersey, and prior to going in the Army, it's about 1942 or 3, I had assisted in the radio maintenance and some fire alarm maintenance, and therefore I was familiar with all of the radio systems and the electrical systems of the fire department. Back at the time of the B-29 crash, I was one of the people who designated to run the generator for the lighting, which was quite essential because there were an awful lot of people awfully interested in going up to the site, and it wasn't good for security reasons, so they started having this roster of people who ran the generators. And everything went about the way it should, but like any small engine with a generator on it, we had to refuel it frequently. And in refueling, you don't refuel with a hot engine, you have to let it cool a little bit. So that meant that the generator was actually off for maybe 15 or 20 minutes. And bear in mind that there were military personnel here from other parts of the country that were not too cognizant of Vermont folklore. And so as I had turned the generator off so the light was going down, one of my buddies across the way said, "Hey, watch out for the panther while the generator's off." And from then on, it got pretty quiet around there, and everybody seemed to come in a little bit closer. And that was the whole thing, and we really never heard anything from the military people that were here. But even during the day, I think they're very careful to see where they stepped and what they were doing out in the underbrush.
When I was reading the Eagle Times in the morning, I said to my wife, "Hey, my picture's in the paper." So then later in the day, my daughter called and said, "You see your picture?" Because I had pictures taken at that time. And how it came to be, by fate, that we were at a party up at Henry Hicks's in Perkinsville. And another party, and I had gone out to the car. And we were just coming back now. It was raining lightly, and the plane went over. It sounded to me, in fact, I said to her that that's a twin-engine plane. The right engines make a lot of noise, and I'd recently got out of the Air Force, and we were flying B-25s with right engines, and it sounded a lot like that. And all of a sudden, the sky lit up, and the engine stopped. So I went in and got my friend John Arneson, and he said, they dropped a flare. He said, that's what it was all about. And I said, no, I don't think so. So anyway, John and I and my brother, I think we were going up Quarry Road. We were going to try to find, I wasn't familiar with the land there. And we came out up above the crash, then came down to it. And we stayed there quite a while. And I picked up a lot of personal things. I found a chute that evidently he had thought he was going to, he had his ID stuck into the outer fold of it. What they were doing is wearing the harness and not the chute. We used to do that too, because the chute would get in your way and you'd just sit it somewhere. And he was 19 years old from Ohio, and that's the only part I read. I read the first part, and what we started to do was piling everything on a rock, so that the Air Force could pick it up when they got there. The tail had broken off. If somebody had only been in the tail, they would have survived, because the tail had broken off and was hanging up. It was below the plane, which quite often happens. The rest of the people in the city didn't have a chance. It ripped the plane apart, and it was burning very badly. It wasn't long after the rain stopped and the moon came out. And we always said, boy, if that guy had only fallen a little while longer, he could have seen the mountain. But no, ironically, that's what it was. It cleared out. The granddaughter just did the report over at Scutney School on this. And she did a great report on it.
I did a report on the Hawks Mountain B-29 crashed. I hiked up there and we took pictures of the crash. He was supposed to go right here, but the red was where he got off track, and he got off track by going up here. And at 12 o'clock a.m., residents of Brattleboro, Vermont heard a twin-engine aircraft pass overhead, and it circled Springfield, Vermont at 12:05 and crashed into Hawks Mountain at 12:15. This is from the New York Daily News, and the highlighted one is my grandpa.
The crash investigators hired a local surveyor, and he went to the scene and really did something I haven't seen in any of the other 125 crash reports related to the state of Vermont, and that is he drew some really excellent diagrams. This was done 3 or 4 days after the accident, and this was Mr. Titcomb that did this.
He loved maps and drawing. That was his profession, really. And so he went up and surveyed it, tried to decide what was happening. They figured that the plane was climbing when it hit, from the way the trees were sheared off.
And in it, he shows exactly what happened, that the plane was flying in this direction here and flew directly into the cliff. And then the wreckage basically falls to the base of that cliff. They mowed off the tops of several trees. Some of the wreckage was actually thrown up the hillside well above the point of impact. So this is a very unique piece of Vermont aviation history, is this type of diagram. It just doesn't exist in any of the other crash sites. He also did this diagram showing where the key pieces of wreckage and several of the bodies were found. And that just doesn't exist in any other crash site here in Vermont either. And interestingly, he points here and draws, this is the tail section of the bomber. That was the largest piece that survived the crash. The rest of the plane basically just disintegrated in the crash itself. Well, in Mr. Titcomb's survey, he did a marvelous job of pointing out there's an engine here where he found where that had rolled down the hill. Here's another engine here. One of the most interesting things, I think, is that the propeller, now there were 16 blades. There were 4 blades on each propeller on this thing, and he sketched in where one of the blades landed far up the mountainside, way above the point of impact, and he was able to find that up there. Down in this area here is where he depicts several fallen trees, and that's also where he was able to identify some of the bodies landing in the wreckage. In this map, he also sketched out the landing gear, and that still exists on the crash site today. It's actually up on top of the ledge where they hit. That's the one that he's got sketched here. He doesn't show the one that landed at the bottom of the cliff, and that's still there in the woods also. This photo shows the point of impact and then how the crash scene decimated the forest right around the actual point of impact. You can see charred trees, and you can see where the wreckage actually has some burn marks on it also. So it was a pretty intense fire. A lot of the aluminum in the aircraft itself actually melted and still remains on the site. In the official Army Air Corps crash investigative file, there were only 4 photographs of the crash scene, and unfortunately the originals were all destroyed, and now it only exists on microfilm. But these are photos of the crash site taken from that microfilm, showing various views of the crash site a day or so after the accident.
I never saw it rain like that. It was just a deluge. Yeah, bad night. And the mountain would have gone up in flames if it hadn't been for raining. We had that once, but well, the whole thing would have gone up because 1,000 gallons of gas.
So I didn't know if it crashed or what happened to it, really. So the next morning, I woke up, I went down to Perkinsville, and where I figured something happened, and they said the plane crashed up there. So I hiked up the mountain. There's a lot of people went up there.
Was it crowded already on
Oh,
Sunday?
yes, a lot of people up there. Yeah. And when I got up there where the plane was, those trees that the plane hit, just like somebody cut them off with a chainsaw. Just a smooth cut, you know. It's only about 300 feet from the top, that plane. You almost made the top of it. Yeah. And there's nothing left of that plane but the tail. That's all that was left, just a part of the tail. And then they had the machine gun sticking out of the back. Of course, it must have been so hot that their barrels were just bent right down. People were picking up parts of the plane, bringing it down the mountain. Of course, the MPs were down below and took everything away from everybody.
And of course, the Army was there. It was cordoned off for maybe a week in total. I mean, a few days that they were carrying away debris. And
the whole week, or maybe 10 days, the Upper Falls road was blocked off. The only ones could go is up to the Mahoney farm and pick up their milk in the Foster farm. And they were farmers. That milk had to go. And the mailman. As far as sightseers, if they wanted to see it, they walked.
I lived on the Quarry Road. That's the road that goes up by the pink house just past the school, which is right at the base of the mountain practically. I heard they hit it when it hit, because I was inside the house. I had no idea what it was, but within a couple of hours there was army men all over the place. And there were people walking up the road with high-heeled shoes on, all dressed up in their Sunday outfits, you know. And I got stopped 6 times from my house to my sister's house by the army people. It wasn't very long before I bet there were 10,000 people in that town. That town was a town of 200 maybe. It was a pretty busy place there for a while.
What I remember of that event is that I was in my truck on Route 106, traveling along the riverbank towards perhaps halfway, 2/3 of the way from Perkinsville to Downers Corner, to when the whole world seemed to light up with a bright yellow light that lasted perhaps 2 or 3 minutes and then died down to a light on the side of Hawks Mountain. I had received a report of wires down in the Greenbush area and had called in someone to replace me as night operator of the Perkinsville switchboard, and was on my way to check out that problem. I could not figure out what had caused that light until sometime later when I returned to the telephone office and we began to receive inquiries for information about a plane that had crashed. The next morning I was busy with telephone problems, but I saw several U.S. government vehicles in the village and on the highway and heard that a B-29 had crashed on Hawks Mountain and that access to the site had been restricted. I never got to the site, but as I was very busy with the telephone system, which was at that time a magneto telephone system, turn the crank to call the operator or to ring someone else on your line. Many government vehicles went past our office, which was on the riverside of the Upper Falls Road, the second house from Route 106.
I worked for the Bryant Grinder Corporation, where I met some older folks that had gone up to that crash site. And the group from Baltimore that went up, Elbridge Thomas, who passed away a couple years ago, was in my department. He told me that a group from Baltimore had walked up there that night to see the site, and he remembers, you know, the fire and rainy, foggy and all, and said he saw what looked to be bodies that were very charred there. And the next day, you know, millions of people going up there. In later years, there was an aircraft mechanic that worked at Bryant Grinder, and he had a fuel injection pump that came off that wreckage. It was off one of the engines. And I guess there was another party that came up the other side of the mountain to it. Now, I guess they got there similar the same time. My father-in-law, they had been to a dance, and they heard the crash and saw the glow on the top of the mountain. And that's Bill Hagan of Greenbush, which is just up from down his Four Corners.
Welcome to the New England Air Museum. I'm standing here in front of the New England Air Museum's B-29 Jack's Hack, and we're going to explain to you a little bit about this airplane today and its connection with Springfield, Vermont. I happen to be from Springfield, Vermont. I'm a graduate of high school there in 1955, and I've been working here at the Air Museum for a number of years, and we put this plane in shape for the public to see and to show it's kind of the property of the 58th Bomb Wing, which was the first group in the Air Force to fly the B-29 in World War II. We're looking at a scale model of the B-29, and the airplane itself is 141 feet in wingspan and 99 feet long. The fame of the B-29 is that it was used to carry the atomic bombs at the end of World War II. Enola Gay dropped the first one on Hiroshima, and the boxcar dropped the other atomic bomb on Nagasaki. This is as we enter the cockpit area, looking all the way to the forward parts where the bombardier sat. I'm sitting in the navigator's chair right now, and across the way is the radioman's chair. This is the navigator's table right here.
I was a navigator on B-29 crew. This is a position that the navigator had on the B-29. There was a lot of technology, high technology at that time in this aircraft, and a lot of equipment here. The whole thing back here in this compartment, it was the largest airplane in the world, but it was crowded. And this turret came down all the way down here nearly to the floor. And the bottom gun turret was raised and almost touched it. So there was very little room to move around in just a short, a narrow passageway to squeeze by the turret and the desk here. That tunnel goes between the forward crew compartment and the center crew compartment over the bomb bays. And right here is the navigator's astrodome, where the navigator would sit up there in this tunnel and use the sextant for celestial navigation. Now, celestial navigation in those days was the most accurate means of navigating. And now, modern days, they have the GPS, just look at the instrument.
This is the hatch where the crew would enter right here. This would lift up. Another reason to have this table fold here. So you're looking at the flight engineer's panel now. He sat facing backwards, but he's the one who ran all the controls for the engines. This is the co-pilot seat. The bombardier kind of had the best seat in the house. You're looking at the Norden bound site right now, which was highly classified at the time, but it's declassified certainly now. But it was a very, very high secret piece of work that allowed the bombs to drop accurately. His seat would come back like this, and there he sat, right in the front of the airplane. This is the pilot's side right here, which duplicates pretty much the co-pilot's side. They had control of the throttles. They could run the engine's throttles, but they didn't have control of the mixtures of the propeller controls. That was the flight engineer. The emergency brake handle is right here between the pilots. This console operated the autopilot back here, and these buttons here would be to feather the propellers if they lost the engine in flight.
Were you in Springfield when the plane crashed?
I was sound asleep, I'm sure, on Lincoln Street when it happened. I was 10 years old, and of course everybody knew about the crash following it. But my connection with the crash was that the plane crashed on my wife's grandparents' property. And my father-in-law was one of the first ones, not one of the real early guys to get up there, but he had been to the site. And I can remember the stories they would tell about the idea. The Mahoney farm, my wife was a Mahoney, the Mahoney farm was the center of operations for the newspapers covering the story. So people were filing their stories for the New York Times and the Boston Globe, as I understand it. And I think in terms of that old kitchen telephone, probably with a crank on the old farm. I'm not sure if it was a crank phone or not, but that's the way I associate it. And somebody had made a comment about that my father-in-law, somebody asked, well, how do we get up there? And did anybody know? And my father-in-law said, yeah, he knew how to get up there. And they said, have you been up there? And he says, yes, I've been up there. And they looked at him, and his clothes were clean and all that stuff, and they didn't believe he'd been up there. Well, he was a farm boy who hunted and trapped, and he knew his way around the mountains without getting all dirty and stuff. But he'd made the trip up there, I guess, within probably at least the first 12 hours of the crash or so. Well, there's one other connection with this crash on Hawks Mountain, and that is when I was working on the airplane in restoration, and a man came around the corner. I came around the tire as he was taking a picture, and he said, that's great because it'll show how big the tire is. He said, I sure wish I could, do what you guys are doing. I said, well, come on, we're volunteers. And he said, well, I don't live close enough. I said, well, we have people that come from a distance away or so. And so where are you from? He said, Tennessee, Knoxville, Tennessee. And come to find out it was his dad that was in that airplane, sitting where you're sitting when the crash occurred, probably. Probably night. Mm-hmm. He was 3 years old.
The crash occurred less than 2 years after the end of World War II, on the eve of the Cold War. So it was a time of great transition.
At the end of World War II, the free world was faced with Soviet aggression, actually, with expansion of communism. And this resulted in the beginning of the Cold War just as soon as we had finished World War II.
The air forces of the world and the American air forces, Naval, Marine, and Air Force, were going through a tremendous transition at the time from the propeller era to the jet era. But this had not actually caught up with the bomber force. There were not actually any operational jet bombers at the time. And so this is why, in essence, you see a World War II bomber involved in this accident. As World War II was winding down, in March of 1945, the Allies were shocked to learn that Russia was flying a copy of the B-29 bomber.
They had the B-29 type aircraft. They interred 3 of ours, one of them right out of the very squadron I was in India, and copied them.
In March of 1946, with the reorganization of the Army Air Force, the Strategic Air Command was activated in March of 1946. And this was the organization that was going to be tasked with flying the jet bombers that were on the drawing boards at the time. Looking down the road, they knew they would have to man these aircraft with highly trained crews.
Our original B-29 unit had been brought back to be the nucleus of the peacetime bomber force, which became the Strategic Air Command. Our B-29s were brought back to the States, but very few of them were ever put into use after the war because of the amount of flying time that they had on them, the age of them. We had newer airplanes. There were always new replacement airplanes coming over. And all those that were in the peacetime operation then, the Strategic Air Command, were the newer ones out of World War II and ones that had come off the production and never got into combat even.
Training for these outfits, these bomb wings, bomb groups as they were called, was primarily long-range navigation, and that's how you wind up with a bomber flying virtually across the country. They, as soon as possible, they took these B-29s and flying them on long-distance training missions. The B-29 flight to Vermont was one of these training missions. Weather alone was not enough to turn back a mission like this. There would be a lot of explaining to do. They didn't really have a choice to pick the weather. And of course, just flying across the country, you're likely to encounter different types of weather anyways. They were highly motivated. Pressing on is what they were paid to do under any circumstance. It's what they wanted to do. They had a job to accomplish. And the job of flying a long-range bomber was one of pressing on irregardless of the conditions. Many of these people had done all of this and then encountered enemy anti-aircraft fire and enemy fighter aircraft in World War II after going through bad weather and everything else. So it was pretty well expected of them to, if they filed a flight plan from point A to point B, to get to point B. And calling it a timeout because of bad weather was probably not something they were often willing to do.
In this cramped compartment, we were confined on long missions. The first mission I ever flew, first combat mission out of India, was against a target at Kuala Lumpur, which was the capital of Malaya then, Malaysia now. It was 16 hours in length. And that was about average. Average, I guess, was about 15 hours on a combat mission. We were young, we could do it then. It didn't bother us. In our training there at Tucson, we were not assigned an airplane. We flew any airplane that was ready, assigned to our crew for a training mission. And that airplane we were on that day went into Hawks Mountain. It was a fairly new airplane with good condition.
At Grenier Army Airfield, which is now the Manchester Airport, there was an Air Force organization there, and they took a team from there, overland, to come to the area and take charge of the reclamation and the search for survivors. The manifest appeared not to have been filled out correctly, and the count of how many people were aboard and how many bodies there were didn't really coincide initially, and it took a while for the Air Force to investigate this. And while that was going on, there were some rumors that started up, I guess you could say, and including one that there was a female on board, but there was never any evidence of that. One of the things that made it confusing was there were apparently a few people that got off in Pittsburgh and a few people that got on there, and that transfer of passengers may not have been properly documented the way it should have been, and that undoubtedly led to some of this confusion.
After the crash, it was determined that they had discovered evidence of 12 persons being killed in the crash. That would ordinarily have been 11-man crew aboard a B-29. One enlisted man had approached us in the operations at Greater Pittsburgh as Fessler, Gassett, and I went into the weather office. He wanted a ride up into the Boston area. He'd heard from the operations people there that our plane was going on up there. And he was aboard. he was one of the ones killed. His name was Robert Stewart. I didn't know his name. When I was standing there, the three of us were there when he approached Fessler, but I didn't know his name until read it later. At the site of the crash, the rescue party at first identified remains that would indicate 8 people were killed. And that's what was initially reported. Later, they found evidence of 4 other bodies. And the mystery then was, who were the additional ones? The flight clearance to Boston, from Greater Pittsburgh to Boston, was made out with only 8 names on it. And so the rescue party apparently had been looking for 8 bodies. When they found evidence of 4 additional persons being killed, they would have been at loss as to what to do. My theory is then, what could they have done? They couldn't have gone to civil authorities because nothing would have been in the records from the clearance. The only thing they could have done then was to contact our 43rd Bomb Group at Tucson. In doing that, it would have gone to our squadron, 64th Squadron, and this was in the hours of darkness, Sunday morning. Someone would have been called in to provide the additional names. And what would have happened? They would have been given the names of the flight crew. And that's why I think my name was listed as being killed. And to my memory, and I've thought about this considerably, I've always stated that the hitchhiker's name was not on the casualty list, because I recognize the names of all of our crew members, of course. And there was no name that I didn't recognize on it. I've always thought that.
If you were an acorn, you would want to know, but you don't need to do it.
Oh, for this? Oh yeah? Oh yeah. Yep. Oh yeah, it shows it.
Where the plane crashes is really rough terrain. It's exposed ledges, steep hillside, etc. And there's one place there where it clearly exhibits the force of the impact, when there's a piece of metal actually driven right into the ledges, and no amount of human power could ever pull it back out of there again. Well, this is one of the 4 radial engines that powered a B-29 bomber, and that's actually just a small portion of it there, but these were massive engines. This just shows some of the intricate gearing inside one of those old engines. And sitting next to it is a lot of the exhaust piping that went with it, and which is kind of interesting because the B-29 bombers really suffered from engines overheating, and they never did really get all of those bugs worked out When you look at this, the aluminum or silvery looking material has actually all been melted by the fire after the crash. Normally those would all look like fins, like a radiator even.
This is a restored version of the Wright's R3350-23. This was an earlier version on B-29s. Later they came out with a version which was the -57 engine of the 3350. It has 18 cylinders. There are 2 banks of 9 cylinders in a ring. This is a radial engine putting out about 2,200 horsepower per engine. This version was carbureted. The later version was fuel injected. During development of the B-29, it was a weapon that we wanted to get into service, so it actually was authorized for production before it was really ready to go into operation, so that none of the 4,000 or so B-29s that were built went directly from the factory into combat. They all had to go to modification plants and be modified with the latest changes to the engine before they could go into service. Bell and Martin and Boeing were the manufacturers of the B-29s. The Boeing B-29 and Boeing Wichita and Boeing out in Washington produced the airplane. As I say, there were about 4,000 produced, and today we know of only about less than 3 dozen B-29s in existence, and maybe 20 or so are housed and restored in fairly like new condition.
I worked for Bryant Grinder for off and on for 35 years, and the history of Bryant Grinder was that we built internal grinding machines, and we built the machine that Wright company bought. It ground all the parts that were on the Spirit of St. Louis, and the Bryant history reads that machines that we built ground 90% of all aircraft parts in World War II. And at that time, Springfield was number 7 on Hitler's hit list.
And how does that relate to the engines that were on the B-29?
Well, they were probably ground, the internal parts were finished by Bryant Grinders, no doubt. It's just a piece of town history, that's it. I went in the Navy in 1961, and I worked on those engines up in Brunswick, Maine for 3 years. And I got out in 1965.
So the engines that were on this B-29 were still being used for...
Yeah, when I got out in 1965, they were starting to phase them out. They were going with the turboprop. They were quite a motor, very powerful, and they were used on a lot of planes. Even the single-engine fighters used them. The big Navy AD-1 had them. And there were 2 versions. They were the same engine, but one came with a carburetor and the other came with a fuel injection. So I'm interested in those motors, and I'd like to get up to that crash site and see them. I haven't seen one in years, since 1965. But they weren't easy to work on. They were very compact motors. And used to cut your hands working down in the hard places to safety wire everything.
Here's 2 more of the radial engines. These are really large radial engines, some of the biggest ever built. Extremely powerful, extremely reliable, except in the B-29's case, they had a tendency to overheat. If you hike to the crash scene and look at these today, you can really see evidence of the fire that engulfed these after the impact. The most interest here is you see that tube that kind of points towards the ground. That was actually the base of where one of the 4 propeller blades would have attached to the engine right at that point. Okay, this is part of the casing that went around the propeller. You can see here the round openings down in the bottom right, and on the extreme right, that's where the propeller blades actually extended out from, and you would have had a total of 4 blades underneath this particular bracket.
Now there's still one B-29 that is airworthy, isn't there?
Yes, that's right. The aircraft is called Fifi, and it's operated by the Commemorative Air Force, and it occasionally flies around the country to various air shows. And it's great to see an example of this very important aircraft actually flying in the air. So it's a wonderful flying museum, you might say.
And well, I love to tell the story of the time I got the telephone call from the fellow who wanted to know, did I want one of the propellers? And I said, no, thank you. And then I told Willis Wood, our president, and he said, of course we want it. So I had to call the man back, and he brought over the propeller.
These are the artifacts we have from the B-29 crash on Hawks Mountain. A few motor parts and one of the four-engine plane, and each engine had a four arms of propellers, and this is one of the arms. This was given to the Society by Ted Delaney. I was pleased to read an article in the Eagle Times recalling the crash of the B-29 on Hawks Mountain in 1947. During World War II, I was a commissioned officer in the U.S. Army Air Force and served as the navigator on a crew of a B-29 bomber group. I was still in active reserve when the crash occurred in Vermont, but recall a newspaper article my parents sent me. Many years later, perhaps in the 1970s, I was supervising the site work on an old farm in Sullivan County, New Hampshire, when a bulldozer uncovered a propeller blade in the remains of a tumble-down shed. I took one look at it and knew it was from a B-29. And after some research, he found that it came from the Hawks Mountain wreck, and kept it for quite a while and then donated it to our society.
A B-29 bomber had four propellers, four blades on each propeller. Each blade is 8 feet long, which means the overall propeller is 16 feet from tip to tip. And it's very, very rare in any of these crash sites that you'll ever find any propellers or parts thereof left behind, because that's the first thing that souvenir hunters grab. And if they don't grab them, scrap dealers do, and these things all vanish. So it's very rare. In fact, it's exceptionally rare that the Historical Society has one of these blades off the Hawks Mountain crash in its possession. Not only is it extremely unique and rare, but it's an absolute treasure for them to have in their collection.
I think what you're looking at now is the handle to activate a bomb door. At least that's what the tag says on it. And then to the far right is a roller bearing from the engine. And then this on the far left, this tag says that it's a part of a wobble plate or swash plate. It was maybe part of a hydraulic pump or a fuel pump, or then it says, or could have been something completely different to transmit motion in some place. Gear could have been made by a machine built by Fellows Gear Shaper.
This is one of the heavier pieces off a B-29 bomber. This is one of the landing gears. And that round section that's underneath the log is actually one of the wheels that the rubber tire went on. And that all burned up, and if you look closely at this, you can see still evidence of scorching from the massive fire that took place after the crash. You would really need a bucket loader to pick this thing up and move it. It's just that heavy.
Here's another
what's
piece
that?
of it. I wonder what that is.
A B-29 bomber, like any large plane, had two landing gears, one under each wing. We saw the landing gear from one wing down at the bottom of the cliff. Well, this is the other landing gear on top of the cliff where the plane crashed. And again, this is a massive piece of steel. It actually was called a hydraulic shock, which was a combination of pneumatics and hydraulics. kind of like a gigantic shock absorber when the plane landed, and your landing wheels would have been attached to this. The landing gear on a B-29 bomber, to give you some idea of how heavy it is, I would suggest it's roughly the same weight as a small automobile. Gives you an idea how heavy and how rugged that is. This is actually where this landing gear is on that cliff there.
There.
Yeah.
Oh, and then the propeller was way, way up. I
Yeah.
didn't go that far.
Yeah.
Said something about parts of a cockpit, but I didn't see any framework or anything.
No.
No. And I went pretty much up to the, I'd say it was the top of the mountain.
Wow.
It was an interesting journey. I'm surprised that there wasn't more sheet metal, you know, but of course with the fire it probably consumed most of it.
Oh, yeah.
Aluminum is, doesn't take, I think, 1,800 degrees or so to melt it, so.
Right.
This crash site, like any crash site, is never completely cleaned up. And if you poke around in the underbrush and the leaves, you'll always turn up little pieces of wreckage. This here appears to be probably an engine mount mixed in with some exhaust piping. That piece there, I would say, is clearly a flange, and if I was to hazard a guess, I would say that's probably from the exhaust somewhere, perhaps part of the manifold. And I can't tell exactly what this piece of wreckage is, but clearly the tree has grown around it. And that's not terribly unusual at some of these older crash sites where wreckage either lands in the trees or falls near them, and the tree actually grows up and around the wreckage, and it's therefore embedded inside. This is kind of a unique piece for this particular crash site in that this shows some of the actual aluminum from the airplane. Several factors play in here. The first is that the plane flew directly into a cliff and disintegrated, so that's the first thing that happens. And then the second thing that happens is a fire, which tends to melt a lot of the remaining aluminum from the wreckage. The third thing is that the Air Force, after they finished picking up the remains of the crew and anything else they wanted to salvage, which, by the way, wasn't much, they dynamited the crash site and blew up everything else that was there into even smaller pieces. Subsequent to that, souvenir hunters and salvagers have been in and carried away almost all the remaining aluminum. So that leaves this particular piece here as being rather unique, that it's still unseen.
After it was all settled, they hired my oldest brother and another fella to bring some of the stuff down from the mountain. They had a pair of horses, and they dragged some of that stuff down from the plane for the military.
And finally, they destroyed, or tried to, most of the wreckage that was left, so that people flying over wouldn't think it was a new crash.
These crash sites, traditionally people have gone in and everybody picks up a little piece of it and walks away. I think we need to look at these more as historic sites. It's okay to go in and look at these things, but people really shouldn't take souvenirs away that they're going to just take home and then lose interest in it and throw it away. You have to keep in mind that this crash site, like so many others, servicemen lost their lives here. This is kind of a sacred site, and people should not be picking up souvenirs and walking away with them.
Well, when we were there, we were cautioned not to, please don't take anything with you.
When I first visited the crash site, I'm guessing was around 1989, maybe 1990, and there were still some of the passenger seats all bent and mangled laying there in the wreckage. This is a piece of aileron off the bomber. This was recovered in 1997, I believe. And you can still see that some of the fabric that covered it is still on this piece. And this would have been on the very trailing edge of the wing, and this is what helped cause the plane to turn and bank. This is a rather astounding find that took place at the crash site very near the 50th anniversary. This is one of the 50 caliber machine guns, or the back end of a 50 caliber machine gun, and you can see the incredible violence that happened when they hit this ledge head on, because they actually took the gun and split it right in half, left to right. Absolute testimony to the force of the impact of hitting that ledge head on.
We're about to enter the aft pressurized compartment. This is behind the two bomb bays, and in here sat 3 gunners. There would be a blister here normally, a plexiglass blister. There is one on top and one on the far side. This seat up on this pedestal was the central fire controlman. He sat up here and he was the one who directed the guns. He could assign the various turrets to the various gunners. This would rotate 360 degrees. And as I said, he was the master gunner. The tail gunner's compartment. He had 250 caliber machine guns, like most of the other turrets. The tail gunner would come in through the hatch, crawling on his hands and knees and coming through that hatch down there. The seat would fold down. He would sit here, and the seat is adjustable for height also. He has 2 footrests down there. You can see his portable oxygen bottle and his gun sight right here.
In 1997, on the right after the 50th anniversary of the crash, Lieutenant Fessler's widow donated his uniforms, their wedding photographs, letters he had written home to her, his medals, pretty much everything that had belonged to him, and including the flag that's behind me here, which is now in the museum. And this came home on his coffin after the crash. At the time of the crash, Mrs. Fessler was pregnant, and in June of 1997, as we approached the 50th anniversary, I received a call from the Vermont Department of Transportation, Agency of Transportation, and they wanted to know if I knew anything about some big plane crash down near Springfield. And I said yes, probably the B-29 bomber, and they had been contacted by the Fessler's son, Bob. And he wanted to come up from Oklahoma and actually go in and find his father's crash site, a father whom he never knew because he was born after the crash, and try and have some contact with his roots, with his father's fate. And on Father's Day, 1997, the 50th anniversary of the crash, Bob and I hiked into the crash site so he could see where his dad went down. And it was a very interesting story there because as we were sitting there looking at some of the wreckage, we suddenly could hear voices coming from off in the woods in the distance. And it turned out to be the Wethersfield Historical Society coming up to honor the memory of these 12 airmen on the 50th anniversary. And both Bob and his mom, when she learned about it, were just extremely touched. And they thought it was just wonderful that people in Vermont would remember these airmen 50 years later. It was a stunning event. In the Army Air Force, at various stages of training, pilots were given certificates to show that they had reached a new level of certification, and this happens to be one of Lieutenant Fessler's certifications for being a qualified pilot on B-29 bombers. I also have here a copy of Bob Fessler, Lieutenant Fessler's individual flight record, and sadly, on June 14th, 1947, it says, closed out, deceased, aircraft accident, Springfield, Vermont. That's the final entry on Lieutenant Fessler's flight record. But one of the things that she sent me, which really touched me the most, was a specific photograph, which I think says it all about these 125 crashes in Vermont. And this is a photo taken at her husband's grave, which is in the Long Island National Military Cemetery. And this is Mrs. Fessler with Mr. Fessler, the pilot's father, standing over that grave. And it's important to note here, this is actually a mass grave because 5 of the crew, including Lieutenant Fessler, the Air Force was unable to identify their remains specifically, so it became a mass grave. But I think this photo says it all right here. This is the tragedy of military plane accidents.
I'm a distant relative of the co-pilot of that plane that day. His great-great-grandfather and my great-great-grandfather were brothers. They grew up in the town of Andover on East Hill. Doing some genealogy research, I stumbled onto Jean Louisa, the sister of Will, the co-pilot. His name was Wilford E. Gasser. He was named after his grandfather, who was also a Wilford Everett. The village of Gassets, which is a railroad station on the railroad within the township of Chester, was named for my great-grandfather, who was the first station agent there in the 1850s.
So it's really ironic that Will Gassett, the co-pilot, would end his life just a few miles.
Next town over.
The town named after his family.
Yeah.
Will Gassett, the co-pilot, was a young second lieutenant, and he had graduated from West Point in June of '46, little less than a year before the crash. And after that, of course, he had gone through flight training. He was a great person. He was likable. He was smart. Having been selected for West Point would prove that. Good personality. The evening that when I was going to leave the airplane, leave the crew at Greater Pittsburgh, go over to the civilian side of the airport and get on the commercial liner, before I left there, I checked my wallet. I didn't have enough money for the flight ticket. I had inquired about the flight. There was an airplane waiting for the weather to clear in Washington. I knew what the fare was going to be. I didn't have enough money. And I borrowed $20 from Will Gassett and gave me a $20 bill. I want to add right here that week after the crash, back in the Delaware area, I wrote a letter to our squadron adjutant in Tucson and enclosed a check for $20 to be included in Will Gassett's estate. I had flown with that crew for about 6 months, and we got to know each other fairly well. However, in our flight duties, being the navigator on the crew, the navigator worked primarily with the two pilots on a cross-country flight, you might say. And of course, later on in target area, working with a bombardier, worked with a radar officer. But I worked primarily with the two pilots, so I had more dealings, and I guess I knew Bob Fessler and Will Gassett better than the other crew members. We were all friends, and we were just normal young people that age, all in our 20s, just like any other younger people. Some of us were married. We had the same interest and did the same things as other young people our age. We weren't any different because we were flying those airplanes, and people think we were doing it for thrills. We weren't doing it for thrills. We were doing it for two reasons, I would say. One is we did like what we were doing. We did like it. The other reason was that we had grown up in the Great Depression, and we knew what the employment situation was. We knew what job conditions were, and we liked the job that we had, and we were fortunate to have it. After that accident, I went on and completed a 30-year career in the Air Force. And when I retired, I went to work at Clemson University as assistant to the president, and actually had a second career on that job. After I retired for good, permanent retirement, Thelma and I took a vacation trip up into Vermont in the early 90s. And while we were there, we made a trip, a visit to Perkinsville with the purpose of looking for Hawks Mountain. I wanted to see Hawks Mountain where the crash had occurred. And as we had driven through the town of Perkinsville on the outskirts, we saw a lady at her mailbox in front of her house.
I thought he was after information. People got lost because it was an out-of-state car. So I said, "Can I help you, sir?" And he said, "Yes." He said, "My wife and I are looking for Hawks Mountain." And I said, "You turn right around and there," and I pointed up there and I says, "There it is, right there." "Oh my goodness." And I said, "Well, how would you like to come in and have coffee or tea?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "I think I have something that would interest you." Well, he was some surprised, I'm telling you. He said, "I was supposed to be on that plane."
And he just happened to stop you, and
Yeah.
you were the one that had a whole scrapbook of
Yeah.
information.
Yeah.
Now you say that your father called you the night of the crash?
Yep, he was living in the nursing home. He used to be a nurse's home up to White Acres. Now it's the family center. And he called up and he said, "Frederica Rachel, there's a fire in Perkinsville. Look out your window," because I lived in Springfield. And sad and just unbelievable that something like that could happen. And to happen in a little small town like that, of course it's full of mountains.
And this is the letter from Colonel Tyndall. And he writes at the end, I'm glad Thelma and I met you that time we were in Perkinsville. You have been not only a friend, but also my link to that tragic event."
I know he always mentions how thankful in every letter that he's always written and said some way along the way how thankful he was that they had met me and still are friends. And to have a colonel stop, that I'm pretty lucky too that I met somebody like that. Yeah, it was an honor.
Ann Butterfield Colwyn lives in Texas and misses Vermont terribly. So she likes to come up once a year for what she calls her Vermont fix. And this was back 2002, I think. And I had invited her and her husband for lunch, and we were enjoying lunch, and there came a knock at the door, and the fellow says, "I've come from Tennessee, and my father was one of the crew on the plane that hit Hawks Mountain. And I've heard that you have an article about it and some artifacts." And I said, "Well, that's interesting, because in my kitchen at this very moment is the daughter of one of the men that went up the night of the plane crash, went up the mountain and found the crash." And so he came in and I introduced him to Ann, and then they excused me and I took him up to the Dan Foster house and showed him what we had. He was 3, it was really ironic. He had a 6-year-old brother and he was 3, and then he had a 6-month-old brother. And their father had been all through the Second World War in the Pacific Theater and had terrible escapes and survived it all, got home, and then on this routine flight up to Massachusetts, he was on that B-29 that crashed into Hawks Mountain, and he got killed. He left his poor wife with the 3 little boys. An interesting coincidence was that Robert Knight had met Mike Jensen, who lives here in Weathersfield, down in Connecticut a couple of weeks before, and realized who it was and where he was from, and so they arranged for him to come up to Wethersfield and to go with Mike to the site of the crash. They had met at a memorial for a B-29 bombers squadron down in Connecticut.
My father-in-law, Chet Freeman, was a B-29 pilot during World War II. In fact, he likes to talk about making one of the last bombing missions of the war. After the Japanese had surrendered, he heard on the way back after a bombing mission that the war was over. My father-in-law and myself went down for the dedication of this B-29. We were inside the cockpit, and he was showing me the different things. And all of a sudden, I heard him talking to somebody behind me. And I wasn't paying too much attention until I heard him say something about Springfield, Vermont. And I looked and I said, "What are you talking about?" He says, "My father was in a B-29 that crashed in Springfield, Vermont." I said, "I know exactly what you're talking about, and I know where this thing is." He says, "That was great." He says, "Because we were just going to go up there and try to find somebody that could take us there." So the next day, I had him meet me where I work downtown here, and Bobby Knight and his wife and his granddaughter went up to Hawks Mountain, and we went up through the trail there. He walked around and was, you know, it was sad for him, obviously, but it was also exciting for him because this is something he wanted to do his whole life. And at some point while we were up there, he got his cell phone out and called his mother. And there, if you think about it, that was Clayton's wife, you know. His father was the radio man, and while we were walking around, Bobby found what he thinks was the radio, or a part of it. And so I said, "Well, if anybody deserves that, you do." And so he took that with him. So, it was a great day.
So that was great that you were just in the right place at the right time to overhear that.
I think about that a lot. I think, you think about, we were at that museum, and there was probably 300-400 people there. It was just by luck that we happened to be there in that plane at that particular time, because we could have gone that whole weekend and never have encountered them. And even if we had, that might have not have come up in the conversation, about this whole thing. But to have had this conversation in the cockpit of a B-29, I thought was even more remarkable. About 30 years ago, 1978, I was in charge of a youth group. And this one day, I said, I've heard about this B-29 that had crashed into Hawks Mountain. I said, would you guys be interested? And there was about 7 or 8 of them, and we got in the car and we drove up and walked up the trail. We got up to that where the crash site is, and I said, there it is. I said, the plane had crashed right into the side of the mountain right here. And this guy, this kid actually at that point, looked down, bent down and picked up the dog tag of one of the men who was in that plane. Now you think about that.
It was still there.
It was still there after all those years. And to think that nobody had ever seen that. And it wasn't like we were scrounging or anything. He just bent down and there it was. So I had said, that is absolutely remarkable. And I told him, don't ever, throw this away because the dog tag, that's pretty special for servicemen. I saw him about 2 years ago, grown man now, and I said, whatever happened, Scott, to that dog tag? And he said, a few years after that, his uncle helped him locate that family member, or the family, and notified them and mailed the dog tag to him. Mm-hmm. It was Fontana. I think it was that Cesar Fontana. That was him.
I'd been working on the show for the B-29 program for several months, and just by chance, I found out that my neighbor, Joe Cootermarsh, has a story to tell about the crash site in Perkinsville.
A friend of mine and I were hiking up on Hawks Mountain a couple winters ago, and we were hiking from the Baltimore side over to the Perkinsville side. And as we got over to the place where we were looking down to the village of Perkinsville, we decided to head down over the ridge and just happened to come across the crash site. I'd been up there before in the past looking for it, just happened to come across it. The thing that kind of surprised us was the amount of debris that's still up there. I mean, there's still, from the ridge all the way down to, I guess, that access road, we were finding pieces of metal all over, including one of the engines we came across, too. This is a piece that I took off, and my buddy did too. We just brought a souvenir home.
So that would be the outer part of the plane. That was zinc chromide paint, the color, and that the rest of it perhaps was painted that for the interior and has been worn away because of all the weathering over the years, over the past almost 60 years now.
I did show this to my dad, and he told me that his mother had been outside the night that the plane went over, and she remembered seeing it and actually looking up and seeing someone in the doorway of the plane. So that was his story. I always wanted to find out more about the crash, so I am looking forward to this show.
This was a large bad weather system. It wasn't localized thunderstorms or anything like that. It's probably only 10 knots of wind that you hadn't known about that can put you off that much. I think that had they known they were in a mountainous area, they would have never been so low. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, that's common. When we look at wrecks, especially military wrecks during the World War II and immediately the post-war era, they're typically found on mountaintops. And these are what they call controlled flight into terrain. It's not as though the crew lost control of the plane and stalled the aircraft into the ground. What it actually is that the crew didn't know where they were, didn't realize that they were near mountain peaks and were flying too low.
And that's still considered Vermont's worst aircraft disaster.
Yes, by far. I think there's nothing that compares in the loss of life as this aircraft crash in 1947.
When we heard that plane, you knew it was a problem. Especially what it would have been, the size of it, the noise. You just felt like ducking or something. It was terrible. It must not have been very far over our head. It was an awful night all the way around, weather-wise, and the tragedy. The people were just so sad about the whole thing.
We left and went back through the town of Perkinsville. We talked to 3 or 4 different persons then. One man was working in his garage and in the car repair shop. He stopped his work and came out and talked to us for nearly 30 minutes, I think. Everyone just acted as though they were glad to talk with us, glad to see us, made us feel so welcome, and told us some part of the story of the crash that they remembered. I learned from that visit to Perkinsville what a tremendous impact that crash had made upon the people there in the area, and what an important event in the history of that area that it had turned out to be.
My name is Brian Lindner, and I will be your MC today. First of all, thanks for coming out. This is a great turnout for what we thought would be a very informal ceremony. First off, I'd like to thank VFW Post 771 for being here today as our color guard, and also to the representatives of the Vermont Wing U.S. Civil Air Patrol. And just to give you an idea how these signs work, these folks saw the sign yesterday and want to be part of today's ceremony, which I think is great. Thanks for coming. Today's going to be the dedication of the Vermont Historic Sites Marker. This marks the 61st anniversary of Vermont's worst air disaster, the B-29 bomber crash on Hawks Mountain. As many of you are aware, there was a 60th anniversary ceremony last year which premiered an excellent documentary about this tragedy. Several of the families were here, and it was just a tremendous occasion both for the families and for Vermont history. I'd like to mention our honored guest today. First of all would be Nina Zapfe, the widow of Lieutenant Robert Fessler, the pilot of the plane, and their son, Bob Zapfe. They have come up today from Oklahoma to be here for this unveiling. Thank you for coming. We also have David Whitcomb here with the trumpet in hand. He's the cousin of Oliver Hartwell, the engineer on the plane, and David will be playing taps for us a little bit later in the ceremony. It is Vermont's worst air disaster. 12 young airmen lost their lives in this crash. At this time, I would like to ask Bob Zapfe, son of the pilot, to come forward to do the official unveiling.
Roger. Attention. Present. Arm.
Over there.
This marker, to my knowledge, to the best of my knowledge, is extremely unique. Not only because of what it commemorates and who it memorializes, but also because I believe this is the only Vermont Historic Sites marker where there's different story told on each side of the sign. I'll now read what is on this side of the sign. Bomber crash on Hawks Mountain. At 12:17 a.m. on June 15, 1947, a U.S. Army Air Force Boeing B-29 Super Fortress bomber strayed off course and crashed on nearby Hawks Mountain during a severe storm. All 12 members perished. Assigned to the 43rd Bomb Group, the crew was on a Strategic Air Command training mission from Tucson, Arizona to Bedford, Massachusetts.
It is my honor to read the names of the crew and the passenger aboard the aircraft that crashed 61 years ago. First Lieutenant Robert G. Fessler, pilot, Madison, Wisconsin. Second Lieutenant Wilfred E. Gassett, co-pilot, Brockton, Massachusetts. Second Lieutenant Cesare P. Fontana, navigator, West Springfield, Massachusetts. Staff Sergeant Oliver W. Hartwell, Jr., engineer, Wells, Maine. Staff Sergeant Sylvester S. Michalik, radar operator, Summit Hill, Pennsylvania. Tech Sergeant Clayton K. Knight, radio operator, Knoxville, Tennessee. Tech Sergeant Paul H. Federhoff, Central Fire Controller, Shreveport, Louisiana. Corporal Robert H. Clark, gunner, Jamaica Plain, Massachusetts. Staff Sergeant John J. O'Toole, gunner, Queens Village, New York. Master Sergeant D. D. Jack, gunner, The Dalles, Oregon. Corporal Harry Humphrey, gunner, Albuquerque, New Mexico. And Private First Class Roger M. Stewart, passenger, Wisconsin Rapids, Wisconsin.
Let me end today's ceremony. Not only is this sign mark a truly historic occasion for this area in the state of Vermont, in fact the United States, but on the mountain itself, the crash site is obviously, at this point, we consider this to be a sacred site. And I should ask Gil Whittemore, the current landowner, to please raise your hand. He is the current landowner of the crash site and is doing a fantastic job of preserving it the way it should be preserved, allowing people to visit it with the understanding that they don't take souvenirs. But it's okay to go up and look at it and honor the crew, and I think that's wonderful.
I'm delighted to have Nina Zapfe here with me today. She's come today. This is June 15th, 2008, and we've just had the dedication of the historic marker about the B-29 crash on Hawks Mountain. And she and her son Bob came all the way from Norman, Oklahoma. And it's wonderful that we got to know you last year when you came for the commemoration events, and now you're sitting here. You've come to see my irises again.
Again, right. Yes. Wouldn't have missed it.
And after we got to know you, we learned some more about the story that we didn't know before. And what's the story about the Father's Day of 61 years ago?
Right. Well, they were on their way to Boston because the co-pilot was from Brockton, Massachusetts, and he was going home to see his father for Father's Day. So they made a special effort to come, even though they had been on a training mission before and had been gone 2 or 3 days beforehand, and I was so mad that but Wilfred Gassett was such a darling man, you know, and my husband was wild about him, and he wanted to go home. He was about to have a leave, and so he was going to go home for Father's Day and then have his leave. And so, of course, my husband wanted to take him. Not only that, but if there was ever an opportunity to fly, my husband didn't turn it down. I thought the preacher said today, he read that poem about pilots and how they feel about flying and being near to God. And I thought, I've never known a pilot that didn't feel that way. You know, and so he was anxious to fly. And I said, I was so mad at him because he was leaving me by myself, and here I was feeling sorry for himself. I was 3 months pregnant with my son at the time, and I was so mad at him. I wouldn't kiss him goodbye, and I have really regretted that over the years.
And you've just been joined now by your son, and you kept the full name of your father, right?
Yes, Robert Glenn Fessler Zapfe.
Mm-hmm.
His folks approved that. I said I want him, or my husband wouldn't marry me unless I changed or added his name to Bob's. And so I talked to the Fesslers, and they said, oh, that's fine. It's better for the child. We want you to do that. So, but we left the Fessler there, too. It's because I wanted to. Not because they asked me to. They were real sweet about it.
It was such an honor to do the unveiling today at the marker. That was really nice. Very nice ceremony. I teased Marita about these informal ceremonies where they have a flyover. Wonder what they do for a really fancy occasion.
Well, a little aside, but I think the gentleman who flew over last year and again this year, he was bound and determined that he was going to, he'd worked this all out in his mind of how he wanted to do this.
Marita said he called
that was
me.
Very touching.
You know, I
listened for
his
the
wife was
engines
there, and I thanked her, and I said, be sure to tell him that that was such a sweet thing for him to do, to volunteer to do that.
Yes.
And she said, well, he says when he flies over there, he frequently thinks of this wreck, you know, so he feels kind of close to it, she said. And I thought that was real touching.
Yes. And it was such perfect timing.
Oh, yes.
He just arrived right at the end of TAPS.
Right, right. It was great.
David Whitcomb was the cousin of crew member Oliver Hartwell, Jr. David and his wife Sandy attended the 60th commemoration weekend and the marker dedication the following year. During that dedication ceremony, he played taps for his cousin and fellow crew members. David wrote, "I remember Ollie in our farmhouse kitchen in Littleton, Massachusetts in the winter of 1946-47. He was sidled up to the gleamwood stove, shining the nickel apron. I was 5 years old and thought he looked 7 feet tall in his uniform, silk scarf, and big dark mustache. His hearty laugh filled that kitchen as he visited with my family. During the late 40s and through the 50s, Ollie's parents would visit us from New Jersey. Occasionally, Ollie's name would be mentioned, and I recall how his mother Gladys would gaze out the window or look past and beyond those present. I never heard the crash details discussed by them. All that filtered through the rest of the family was that Ollie died when a B-17 crashed into a New Hampshire mountain in 1947 testing radar. Ollie's papers contain an American National Red Cross certificate for first aid, life-saving, boating, and canoeing, dated July 17, 1940. His sister Caroline said his canoe was always at the ready. He fished, snowshoed, hunted, and hiked. Ollie would have been right at home in Perkinsville in the Black River Valley. I am still coming to know him and am comforted that a part of his soul rests on the side of that mountain with such an eternally beautiful view. The family of Corporal Robert Clark communicated with us and sent a picture of him. The Clark family consisted of 6 boys and 5 girls. His brother David wrote that 5 of the boys were in the service and 2 died during World War II. Bobby, being the youngest, had not seen overseas service during the war. He was in training to be a tail gunner on B-29s. He was on this 1947 flight because he was able to hitch a ride home for a furlough in Jamaica Plain, just outside Boston, Massachusetts. The family expressed gratitude to those involved in commemorating this sad event of so many years ago.